barbarism. It is a genocide. We are seeing the gravest war crimes take place, all of the most prominent crimes against humanity. And that's not just my own words, but that is what is being said by all of the major international legal institutions all around the world today. But I think I want to get straight to the point in this talk. One of the main things you hear people say about Palestine is, how is this happening? How is it possible that we are coming up to the 2-year anniversary of this genocide? Is it just an extreme moral aberration of humanity that we are witnessing, this sense that the world and its moral compass and everything that's good is just collapsing, and there's a kind of dark fog coming over all of humanity? I think that's how a lot of people think. And in some respects, that's true, right? I think we are living through or witnessing very extreme, somewhat moral aberrations taking place every single day. But also, if we think about it, horrific violence, even genocide, is not an alien concept under capitalism. If you look at the history of capitalism, it is littered with horrific events and even genocides and mass violence in many places all around the world. Capitalism has produced and continues to produce war and genocide throughout its history. And all of those events are not the products of just evil-minded individuals who have lost their moral compass. They are, in fact, the product of capitalism itself, and specifically, we would say imperialism and imperialist interests, how they manifest themselves all around the world. As communists, we understand that capitalists do not wage war for patriotism, they do not wage war for democracy or any other high-sounding principles. Capitalists wage war, in summary, the naked truth, for profit. They wage war for profit, to capture foreign markets, sources of raw materials such as oil. That obviously is a big part of imperialism's role in the Middle East, for example. But also, crucially, to expand spheres of influence. That has a massive role in terms of the way that imperialism is dividing itself up all around the world today. And Palestine is the most extreme victim, I would say, of that process under capitalism in 2025 today. But it hasn't just begun in the last 2 years. That is something that we have to say, especially on October 7th, today of all days. We have to explain the historical roots of how the Palestinians are in this position in the first place. Now, this isn't a historical look at everything that has happened in Palestine, but I think because we are in Britain, it is worth starting this lead off with a bit of a summary for the role that British imperialism has played. We are in a unique position in Britain, actually. There's almost a unique duty incumbent upon us as people who want to stop the genocide in Britain to understand and expose the role that British imperialism has played historically in leading up to the genocide of the Palestinians today. Because Palestine was a region, was a country that was colonized by the British. And like many other places, essentially what happened is once Britain had gotten what it wanted out of Palestine, it abandoned it, but left absolute chaos in its wake. Israel itself was established on the ruins of the British Mandate. And you have to think the early 20th century, this was actually still a bit of a high point for the British Empire, although I would say paradoxically it was the beginning of the end of Britain's kind of obvious, overt physical domination of the world. Of course, it still plays a massive role on the world stage as a component part of Western imperialism. But yeah, at this point, it still was at a certain high point. And Palestine was a British colony after the First World War. Essentially what happened was the former Ottoman Empire, the Western imperialists tried to divide it up amongst themselves, and it was the British and the French that tried to carve it up in the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement. But it was British imperialism specifically in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration that took the area and recognised it as a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And that was despite the fact that Jewish people represented not even 10% of the population in Palestine at that time. And the British played a massive role in encouraging migration, Jewish migration to Palestine at that time. And they allowed immediately, actually, we should say, the formations of a kind of semi-state, what would go on to become the Israeli state then more formally in 1948. The British allowed and helped that process take place. And why did they do that? It's because they saw Zionism and this emerging Zionist project as something that could be quite useful for them. They thought, actually, this is perhaps a more useful way for us to maintain a bit of control in this region using Zionism without having the cost of physically always being there ourselves, that same overt control. And if you think about it, that's also a bit of a summary for how a lot of Western imperialism maintained itself after the so-called decolonization process that took place over the course of the 40s, 50s, and 60s in different colonial revolutions around the world. All of these countries are still absolutely dominated by the advanced capitalist countries in the West. They've just changed the way they do it. They do it through the IMF, they do it through the global financial market, rather than necessarily having a physical presence in the same capacity. So yeah, Britain saw the emerging Zionist project as a useful thing, helped it go on its way. And on that basis, Zionism became much, much stronger. And the Zionists were able to get the US and the UN to back their partition plan for the area, ostensibly for the creation of two states, Israel and Palestine. But the Zionists basically just took this kind of vote of confidence from the UN as an excuse to go on a rampage, killing many, many thousands, committing many atrocities against the Palestinians, with the direct aim of driving them off their land. And if you look at all of the historical records, if you look at all of the quotes from all of the early Zionists, even those who are so-called left or liberal Zionists, the aim of their project was very, very clear from the beginning, which was to expel the Palestinians completely from the land so that they could use it for themselves. And I wanted to start by that because there's a lot of talk correctly about 1948 and the Nakba. It's 77 years since the Nakba, which was the mass catastrophe and the mass expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians all in one go. But we have to understand, where did that even come from, the process of 1948 and the actual creation of Israel. And basically anywhere that you see mass horror in the world, British imperialism probably played a role. The British imperialism probably had a hand in creating the most amount of misery and division that you could ever imagine. And in the 77 years since then, the state of Israel, which is a capitalist state, has encroached more and more continuously, not through diplomacy, not through negotiations, but through brute force and brute violence. And that has culminated and brought us to the situation that we are in today. I don't want to spend too long talking or just describing what is happening. We should say, I mean, the situation, particularly in Gaza, it is almost indescribable, the conditions that people are being forced to live in. Man-made famine, disease which is completely rife, the violence that continues every single day, even with the so-called peace plan that Israel has supposedly agreed to. Hundreds of Palestinians have been killed over the last few days after the agreement was put in place. Continued airstrikes, shooting at people queuing up for food. 67,000 people killed officially, 20,000 of them are children. There are thousands of people under the rubble of Gaza. The hundreds of thousands are injured. There are 10,000 Palestinians held in Israeli prisons, including children with no trial, with no charges. And we know that, truthfully, these numbers are completely out of date. The real numbers go far into the hundreds of thousands. I think the truth is they don't have the infrastructure, really, to keep track. There is no infrastructure left in Gaza. It has been absolutely destroyed. But I said, and it's true, I don't think the job of this meeting, and I don't think the job of communists, and I don't think the job of the Palestine movement as a whole today is to continue to describe. It is not to continue to describe the horrors that exist in Palestine. I don't think that is the most important thing. And actually, there are some people in the Palestine movement who wouldn't agree with that. There are some people, and I would say the main focus of the Palestine movement for a long time, and still today, has been the idea that our job in the main is to raise awareness, to keep talking about Palestine and raise awareness to as many people as possible. This is, unfortunately, the position of the self-appointed leadership of the Palestine movement today. In fact, it's the official advice that they give out. Before this meeting, I wanted to look it up. I looked at the Palestine Solidarity Campaign's website to see what they're putting forward on what they call should be a workplace day of action in Britain. Bear in mind, we've just seen workplace action take place in Italy. And I am just going to quote from it, because I think we are too far into this process to try and hide any criticisms or not be blunt, right? This is what they say. Take action in your workplace. Raise awareness of the mass demonstration taking place on Saturday, 11th of October. Hold a lunchtime walkout or photo action and share it on social media. Circulate petitions and letters with your colleagues, calling for pension funds and councils to divest. Organise trade union meetings, teach-ins, or film screenings to raise awareness of the crisis in Palestine. Support the Don't Buy Apartheid campaign, etc., etc. The main thing I thought when I saw those bullet points, when I saw those suggestions, is how much more awareness do we need? Do we really think that the main limit on the Palestine movement today is that people don't know what's going on? I don't think that's the case. Now, that's not to say that there is no role for talking about and describing it, because it is true that propaganda and Zionist propaganda, particularly in the West, for a long time, for decades, had a massive grip over the whole of the movement. It had a massive grip over how people understood what was happening in Palestine. And as I said today, I started this meeting talking specifically about what Britain did historically. But is that all we can do? Is that all we should do? And actually, over the last 2 years, there has been a dramatic shift in people's understanding of what is happening in Palestine. All of the polling shows that young people especially always side with the Palestinians. When they pose it like that, who are you more sympathetic to? All of the polling shows that as time has gone on, more and more people say they side with the Palestinians. And we should say significantly, particularly amongst Jewish communities, particularly in America, which is very, very significant. And actually that has got the ruling class in Israel above all, but the ruling class across the West very, very worried. It's not to say that there isn't an ideological battle to be had. There absolutely is. But that alone is not enough. And actually that has been done for the last 2 years. And what we are saying is, okay, we've had 2 years of raising awareness. We've had 2 years of talking about it, of looking at these images every single day. But what do we need to do now? And also, who are we trying to convince? Because there's a difference also, I would say, within the Palestine movement as who is this awareness aimed at? Is it aimed at politicians? Is it aimed at the legal institutions that supposedly are there to stop genocides from taking place? What is the point of the United Nations? What is the point of the international courts of justice? In fact, if you read what they are writing, they have had the documented evidence for 2 years. They know exactly what is taking place. They know these crimes are happening every single day, and all of these international legal institutions have in fact already declared it a genocide. So no, we are not interested in trying to appeal to those institutions, and we are not interested in abstract awareness raising. We are communists. So first of all, we understand that the genocide in Gaza is the logical conclusion of Israeli and by extension Western imperialism. We understand that capitalism, as I said at the beginning, historically, in many of its colonial projects, has attempted to destroy entire populations before. And we also understand that Israel wants the complete destruction of the Palestinian people, so that Israel is free to embark on a stable capitalist imperialist project. I think this is the point, right? Israel would quite like to have a stable, the ruling class in Israel, in general, capitalism would prefer to rule in a nice, so-called democratic way. It's actually not good for capitalism to have war and to have conflict constantly knocking at its doorstep. And Israel, the Israeli ruling class, understand that so long as the Palestinians exist, they will not have a peaceful, calm, stable, capitalist state in which they can exploit and conduct their interests in the way that they want to. No, it's completely related to the capitalist basis. And the reason I make that point is because, again, I think this is different from the general moralism that dominates discussions about Palestine, or those that think or present it as a question of religion or ideology alone. It is capitalism, albeit it is obviously abetted by quite an extreme ideology, right? Zionism is a very extreme ideology. Nevertheless, these are the actions of an imperialist state. So the reason I make this point is because I think the question that the Palestine movement should be asking itself, and we need to answer, is how do we fight imperialism? And how do we fight capitalism? Or let's be concrete, what should all of us here in this room do now to stop the genocide? Well, we have to start with where we actually are, right? We live in the West, we live in Britain. And the first thing we have to identify is, well, who is our enemy then? Netanyahu, yes, absolutely, I'm sure Netanyahu, to everyone in this room, is considered an evil monster who is on the complete other end of the line to us. But more importantly than that, the message that we want to go into the 11th of October with as communists is our enemy is Starmer. Our enemy is the British ruling class, and it's the British Labour government. I mean, let's take this. I don't know if you saw this. It came out yesterday, this report, saying that the value of UK arms being sent to Israel has actually reached a record high in 2025. And it's actually more than double the amount received in any of the 3 previous years. More than even the Tories. I don't know how I can still be surprised by receiving information like that, but I was slightly surprised given the audacity that the ruling class in Britain is currently on a rampage. It is on a rampage through the mainstream media to tell us that we are not allowed to continue protesting for Palestine, cynically using the attack in Manchester in the most cynical, brave and disgusting way to try and intimidate the whole of the Palestine movement, to use the same smears that it always has done to once again stop us from taking any form of action. Whilst at the same time, they are selling more arms to Israel than ever before. That's why they're doing this. That's why they don't want the protest to take place, because they don't want this information going out and because they're scared. And I think we need to recognise that. The ruling class in Britain and across the West are very worried about what the Palestine question is doing to everything in their own countries, what it is doing to the political situation in their own countries. They are fearful of that. And that means that there's something we have. There's something strong. I think the Palestine movement needs to start acting with confidence and go on the offensive. And I'll come on to exactly how we can take inspiration from Italy in just a moment. But British imperialism is a component part of the Western-backed machine. As I said, UK arms, it's not the biggest component. Of course, that's America can take that role, that's fine. But in Britain, component parts of the F-35 fighter jets are obviously made. So what do we need to? We need to think about how can we have the most material impact on that war machine ourselves, beyond just raising awareness. And that means, as communists, we're saying we need to organise a struggle against British imperialism itself. But I don't think that is the goal of the heads of the Palestine movement here in Britain today. I think their goal lags way behind where consciousness is at. I think what they say on their speeches lags way behind the mood that exists in society. Their goal and their strategy, I would say so far, ultimately has been, let's keep putting moral pressure on politicians in Britain to convince them to stop selling arms to Israel. But we have to ask ourselves this: is it morality that pushes the ruling class to do anything? Can you even understand the ruling class through a moral compass? You can't. You can't. It's not logical, and it's not possible. The only thing that forces the ruling class to change anything, to give any kind of concession, is direct threats to their system and their position, crucially, within it. That is what we have to think about it. And actually, it's on that basis that we should understand Starmer's recognition of a Palestinian state. Should that be considered a victory? Should we be going around thinking, yes, the Palestine movement in Britain has won something? I would say no, absolutely not. First of all, what use is it for Palestine to recognise a state that he's continuing to facilitate its destruction of, that he's continuing to sell arms to, that he's continuing to give political cover-up constantly for Israel every single day? There's no use for that. But also, we know that Israel will never allow the existence of a Palestinian state. The creation of Israel was dependent on its total destruction, and for the last, more than 77 years, it has been on its path to continue that, to make it happen. If you listen to anything any of the Israeli ministers say, they make that very, very clear. They want to finish the job and wipe Gaza off the map entirely. No, Starmer's recognition of Palestine was actually an attempt to try and stop the movement going forward. It was actually a reflection of the fact that the ruling class in the West are very now tied in to the revolutionary potential that lies in the heart of the Palestine movement, not in Palestine, but in Britain, in Italy, in Spain, in Greece, and all across Europe and the West. That is what Starmer was trying to do. Now, we say and we repeat that Palestine is the lightning rod for all accumulated anger in society. And we have to keep saying that because some people, I think, worry that when we talk about Palestine and we take it beyond the question of Palestine and we start connecting it to other things, that somehow we're going to weaken the movement. But it's the opposite. It is precisely when we connect Palestine to all of the other inequality and horrors in people's lives that we strengthen the movement. We make it more relevant and more concrete to the lives of the working class in Britain and all across the West as well. It is precisely when we prove that the genocide in Palestine is not an aberration of the system, but it's a reflection of the system at its most naked, at its most extreme. It's when we prove that we can make conscious the need to do away with this system entirely. Isn't that what this is about? What we are saying to these politicians is if you will have a genocide to protect your interests in the Middle East, then we will get rid of those interests entirely, because we will not allow that to be the world that we live in. That is the job of the Palestine movement today. And I think if the Palestine movement went out with that confidence, it could be enormous. It could be enormous in Britain because it would make it relevant and it would make it concrete. The right wing, like say, oh, you on the left, you don't care about the working class in Britain. You just want to fly a Palestinian flag. You just want to talk about Gaza. We say, yeah, I will fly a Palestinian flag. I will talk about Gaza. And I will prove how the cause of the Palestinians can be the cause of the working class in Britain as well. And it is that idea that terrifies the ruling class above all. It is that idea that terrifies Starmer and terrifies Labour. And therefore that has to be the central idea of the Palestine movement moving forward. Because we live in a system, which is called capitalism, which puts profit above all human life. And it is that system that is also implementing austerity in Britain. It is that system that is killing people in Britain every single day as well. We had a campaign last year, it was this time last year, we were on a university tour, it was called Books Not Bombs, and it was all about linking up the Palestine movement to the class struggle in Britain itself, making precisely these arguments, that the billions that they are choosing to invest in the arms industry is billions that they do not invest in the NHS, it's billions that they do not invest in housing or in education. If you think about this chant that we do in Palestine demonstrations, in our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians. That can mean something beyond sentimentality. That can mean something real when we make it about the class struggle itself. And the truth is we don't have to make it in that way just through nice speeches on the side of the roll. It's actually the ruling class in the West that is making it that way by investing all of this money in militarism, in war, at the expense of welfare. That's why this idea of books not bombs, healthcare not warfare, why can't those also be the main slogans of the Palestine movement in Britain today? This idea can work, and it has been proven, I would say, beyond doubt, by this magnificent general strike that has just taken place in Italy. And think about it. A lot of comrades have made this point. What parallel do you know of a political general strike taking place in a country about an issue that's not to do with that country, ostensibly? Ostensibly, Palestine is a secondary issue. It's phenomenal. It shows just how deep into consciousness the question of Palestine has become. And it has become connected with the class struggle due to the role of workers, due to the call of those dock workers in Italy, which began early on when they were talking about the flotilla, and they raised the idea of shutting down Europe. And I think a lot of people in the Palestine movement, it was being shared, that video. Wow, listen, can that really happen? You know, we've been saying this, we've been chanting this, but can that really happen? And it can when the lead of the working class comes into the movement and comes into the stage. I think this is the way forward for the Palestine movement. And it wasn't just confined to Italy. Also in Spain, we saw 2 million people take to the streets. This was after momentum had been built for a while. 100,000 people came out in Madrid to stop the Israeli cyclist team from taking part in that. These are huge numbers. These are huge scales. The general strike in Italy, solidarity, I've just said that. The other point I wanted to make is this phrase, block everything. Where did they get that from? They took that from France. It's not random also, I would say, that all of these things are starting to happen all at the same time. Now, the movement in France isn't like the main cause of the movement in France wasn't Palestine. It's against austerity. But do you think if we didn't also talk about Palestine on those movements, we wouldn't gain support? Of course you would. Of course you would. And then that phrase, block everything, is being spread all across Europe. And who can block everything? And then that's the important question. Again, moving beyond sentimentality. Who actually has the power to block everything? Well, the dock workers have started it when talking about blocking shipments to Israel. And then other workers, other students are thinking, well, we can occupy this train station, we can block this airport perhaps. And it's that process where people are becoming conscious of the role that they play in society. This is exactly it. You know, for 2 years now, as communists, we have been raising exactly this idea. We've been talking about workers' boycotts, mass occupations, mass strikes, and it was always considered a utopian thing. Why? Because you're never going to get enough people to care about it. But then we should say, well, hasn't that also been the whole strategy of the Palestine movement, is to raise awareness? Then for what? To do what with that awareness? To actually do something, to actually organise it. I would say the Italian general strike represents so far the highest point of solidarity with the Palestinian people that we have seen in years in the West. And it's an inspiration. Why? Because of the role that the working class is playing, and because of the scale at which it has happened. And by the way, let me just say, it's not just that the Italian trade unions are magical bastions of revolutionary spirit, right? You could be convinced that what we're seeing across Europe is some kind of European energy that does not apply to Britain. But that is absolutely false, and that is absolutely wrong. In fact, the biggest trade union in Italy was forced to catch up with the mood that existed outside of it. Mass pressure from below is what forced the unions in Italy to actually put the call out on a coordinated basis for the strike and for it to move forward. And our argument, in summary, as I'm coming to the end of my time, is does that mood not exist in Britain today? Have we not seen up to 1 million people already take to the streets in Britain for 2 years? I have been on I don't know how many demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of people coming onto the streets in defiance of Suella Braverman in the Tories and then the Labour government calling this hate marches, saying this is anti-Semitic. Hundreds of thousands of people again and again and again, but there's been no direction given to that. Our argument is that the mood is there, but the unions in Britain, they have to take the next step. They have to coordinate this. Otherwise, the movement will stay in this kind of limbo where you've got this huge anger and desire to do something that exists out there, and it just feels like it's going to dissipate. And the problem with that is that it creates demoralization and confusion, and people will forget or begin not to believe that we actually can do something. But our argument is a positive one. Our argument is that we absolutely can, it just needs direction. but it needs a conscious political leadership. I want to end on look, this meeting is being held by the Revolutionary Communist Party, but also specifically the Revolutionary Communist students, right? Where we already saw today, actually today across Britain, by the way, there have been a few protests on different university campuses. In Sheffield, for example, our comrades led a rally there as well, and a few hundred students came out. And we need to think about this. Why? Because I've spoken about 2 million people, Ultimately, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the resources, we don't have the size right now here in this room as the RCP to speak to millions of people. We can't do that. We can put demands and put forward this program onto the unions and onto the spaces we do have. But let's start with what we are in this room. And that's students and that's young people. And why? Again, it's not just because students and young people are magically revolutionary, but they have been born into a world where capitalism is producing horror every single day, and they have only seen horror and genocide and war and oppression and climate change under this system. And so young people and students are and can be the most radical layer in society. So let's start with the most radical layer. Let's start with every single university that's represented in this room and talk about how do we turn this university, how do we shut down this university for Gaza, how do we shut down this university for Palestine, and then talk to the teachers and the cleaners and all of the staff in that university, right? Because when we think about Palestine and we think about any horror in the world, it's easy to become overwhelmed, right? The scale of it is huge. And I'm not going to pretend that that's not the case. We don't want to romanticize it. The scale of this is huge. But you start with where you actually are. You start with a meeting like this, and then you make it bigger. And we say, okay, on the 11th of October, we are going to have a massive block of hundreds of communists who aren't there just to stand and go from the start of Embankment to Downing Street, but to spread the idea that the unions in Britain could do exactly the same as Italy. They could do exactly the same as what's happening in Spain. The mood is there. We just need to push it. And nothing will happen without pushing. There is a role for us to play. And universities, think about what universities are. They're a bastion for imperialism as well. The political ideas of imperialism, the lies they put out about what the British Empire was and did for years, but also the conditions themselves. The fact that arms manufacturers are welcomed onto university campuses. Today in Queen Mary, there was a rally, and BAE Systems was also on the university that day, and the university called the police. Why? To protect BAE Systems. That's what they were there for. And the students correctly organised a rally, but they should do more than a rally. The students should refuse to engage with BAE Systems at all. A whole political campaign could be run in Queen Mary and in universities all across the country on that basis. Why is £1 billion invested by universities into the arms industry at all? Why is that money used for that? That's why we say we stand for books and not bombs, healthcare and not warfare. These are the political ideas and the political demands that the Palestine movement could organise itself around. So what's happening in Europe is phenomenal. But what we're here to say is imagine the impact that could be made if Britain joined that movement as well. And you know this phrase, I think about it a lot, and I'll end on this point, you know, our revenge will be the laughter of our children, right? It comes from the Irish role. We're in the Irish sense. Think about what we could do in Britain. What is our revenge against the British ruling class historically for the crimes it played in Palestine and the creation of Israel and the genocide that it's continuing to participate in today? It should be to build a force in the historic centre of the crimes of Palestine that aims all of its energy, attention and struggle at its own ruling class. Think about the role that it could play if we made a massive dent into not just the war machine in the abstract, not just physically stopping weapons, but in the concept of British imperialism as a whole. That would have a massive impact across the West and also in Palestine. That has to be our focus. And the consciousness and the question and the mood around it exists. It does exist in Britain today. It just needs a push. And those who are able to push it are not politicians, they're not people who sit in Parliament, they're not people who sit in the UN or the ICJ or any other self-professed important institution all around the world. The most powerful force in society is the working class when it is organised and conscious of its power. The role of communists today, the role of communists on the 11th of October, is to make that concrete, is to use these demands, is to grow this movement, is to grow the RCP, and actually begin the process of fighting British imperialism, which ultimately is the fight of the British class struggle itself. It's the fight for better wages, it's the fight for better housing, it's the fight for a free NHS, and it's the fight for free education. So hopefully you can join us in that.